Margaret Chen stared at the keys in her hand like they were cursed. Heavy old brass keys that belonged to a house she never wanted to own, her grandmother's house. The one that sat 3 blocks from Ocean Beach in San Francisco, looking sadder with each passing year. She remembered that house from childhood visits. Back then it seemed magical. The creaky stairs, the smell of incense and her grandmother's cooking, the way sunlight filtered through lace curtains in the afternoon. But that was 30 years ago. Now the paint was peeling off in chunks. The garden had turned into a jungle of weeds. Neighbors probably complained about it. Her grandmother, Lynn, had died 3 months ago at 89. A quiet death in her sleep, which everyone said was a blessing. Margaret supposed it was. But blessings came with complications. The house was hers now, all of it. Every sagging floorboard, every outdated fixture. Every room stuffed with 5 decades of accumulated things. Margaret didn't have time for this. She worked morning shifts at a hospital cafeteria and evening shifts cleaning offices downtown. Her daughter, Amy, was 12 and growing faster than Margaret could afford. New shoes every 4 months. School supplies, field trips, the endless small expenses that added up until her bank account screamed in protest. She'd been putting off dealing with the house. It sat there locked up and silent while she pretended it didn't exist. Maybe if she ignored it long enough it would just vanish, solve itself somehow. She knew that was stupid, but denial felt safer than facing the mountain of work ahead. Then her landlord knocked on her door with bad news wrapped in an apologetic smile. Rent was going up, $400 more per month, starting next month. Margaret did the math in her head while standing in her doorway. 400 times 12. That was almost $5,000 a year. Money she absolutely did not have. She could take a 3rd job, maybe weekend shifts somewhere. But when would she see Amy? When would she sleep? That night, she sat at her tiny kitchen table with bills spread out in front of her, numbers that didn't add up no matter how many times she rearranged them. The house keys sat beside her coffee cup, catching the light from the overhead bulb. She picked them up, turned them over in her palm. The next morning, she called a real estate agent. A woman with an energetic voice and optimistic words. Yes, the market was good. Yes, Victorian houses had charm. Buyers loved character. But then came the carefully worded concerns. The property would need work before listing, staging, repairs, fresh paint at minimum. And of course, it needed to be empty. Completely cleared out. How much stuff are we talking about? The agent asked. Margaret thought about the last time she'd been inside right after the funeral. Every room was full. Furniture from different decades. Closets packed with clothes. Kitchen cabinets overflowing with dishes and pots and things she couldn't even identify. The attic was probably worse, a lot, she said quietly. It's a lot of stuff. The agent's enthusiasm dimmed slightly. Well, you'll want to handle that first. Estate sales are popular right now. Or you could rent a dumpster for things that aren't worth selling. Once it's empty, we can really see what we're working with. After hanging up, Margaret felt the weight of it all pressing down. This wasn't just clearing out a house. This was dismantling her grandmother's entire life. Every object had been touched by those wrinkled hands. Every item had been chosen, used, kept for a reason. She thought about her grandmother sorting through these same possessions someday, deciding what mattered and what didn't. Had she known she was running out of time? Had she meant to simplify things and just never got around to it? Or had she wanted someone, Margaret specifically, to see all of this, to understand her life through her belongings? The first weekend, Margaret brought Amy along for company and help. They unlocked the front door together, and the smell hit them immediately. Not bad exactly, just old, closed-up air and dust and the faint ghost of her grandmother's jasmine perfume. It's so dark in here, Amy said, reaching for a light switch. Nothing happened. The electricity had been shut off. Margaret had forgotten about that. They opened curtains and windows, letting in gray San Francisco light and the distant sound of foghorns. They started in the living room. Margaret brought garbage bags and boxes marked for donation, for selling, for keeping, but every item required a decision. Every decision took time. The jade plant on the windowsill still somehow alive despite months of neglect. Her grandmother had grown that from a cutting 40 years ago. The embroidered pillows on the couch. The stack of Chinese newspapers. The photographs in mismatched frames. Amy found a music box that played a tinny, off-key melody. Margaret found her grandmother's reading glasses still sitting on top of a mystery novel, bookmark in place. like she'd just stepped away and might come back any moment. By the end of that first day, they'd cleared maybe a quarter of the living room. Just one corner of one room in a house full of rooms. Margaret's back ached. Her hands were gray with dust, and she felt like crying, though she wasn't sure if it was from exhaustion or grief or the overwhelming impossibility of the task. The second weekend, it rained. Margaret came alone, working through the dining room. The third weekend, she tackled a bedroom upstairs. The fourth weekend, another bedroom. It was like emptying an ocean with a teaspoon. Every drawer contained more drawers. Every box held more boxes. She found things she remembered from childhood, things she'd forgotten existed, things she never knew her grandmother owned. Old immigration papers, recipes written in Chinese characters, a wedding photo of grandparents she'd never met, both long dead, letters tied with string, coins from different countries, a silk scarf that might have been expensive once, some items she kept. Most she didn't. The donation boxes piled up. The garbage bags multiplied. Slowly, gradually, rooms began to empty. Floors appeared. Walls showed themselves. The house started looking less like a home and more like a shell. But Margaret kept avoiding the basement. She'd opened the door once, looked down those steep wooden stairs into darkness, and closed it again. Basements were where the worst stuff accumulated. The broken things, the forgotten things, the things people meant to fix or deal with someday but never did. Finally, on her 8th weekend of clearing, she ran out of other places to avoid. Everything upstairs was sorted. The main floor was nearly done. Only the basement remained. She stood at the top of the stairs with a flashlight because, of course, the basement light didn't work. The steps creaked under her weight. The air grew cooler as she descended. Her flashlight beam cut through darkness, landing on exactly what she expected. Shelves crammed with old paint cans and mason jars, rusty tools, cardboard boxes softening with age and moisture, a broken chair, a rolled-up rug. Decades of debris, Margaret sighed. This would take another full weekend at least. Maybe 2. She stepped off the last stair onto the concrete floor and started moving toward the nearest shelf, already planning her attack strategy. That's when her flashlight caught something odd. Behind the shelves, visible through a gap, the wall looked different, newer somehow, like it didn't quite match the rest of the basement. She stepped closer, curious despite herself. Moved some boxes aside, peered into the shadow, and everything was about to change. Margaret's heart beat faster as she moved the shelves aside. They were lighter than they looked, just cheap metal frames that scraped against the concrete floor. Behind them, the wall definitely looked wrong. Too clean, too new. A wooden panel, maybe 4 feet wide and 5 feet tall, fitted into the old foundation like a door. She ran her fingers along the edges. No handle, no obvious way to open it, but there were gaps, small spaces where the panel didn't quite meet the surrounding wall. She went back upstairs and found a crowbar in the kitchen drawer, one of the few tools she'd kept while clearing the house. The crowbar slid into the gap easily. Margaret pulled. The panel resisted at first, then suddenly gave way with a crack that echoed through the basement. Dust exploded into the air, making her cough. She waved it away and pointed her flashlight into the darkness beyond. A room. A small hidden room. Her hands shook as she widened the opening and stepped inside. The space was barely bigger than a closet, maybe 6 feet across and 8 feet deep. The air smelled stale and old, untouched for years, maybe decades. In the center sat a wooden chest, the kind people used for blankets or winter clothes. Next to it were several cardboard boxes, their tops folded closed but not taped. Margaret knelt beside the nearest box, her knees pressing into cold concrete. She hesitated before opening it. Part of her wondered if she should call someone first. The police, maybe? But what would she even say? She found a secret room in her own house? She lifted the flaps. Her breath caught. The box was full of baseball cards, not loose ones scattered around like she'd seen at garage sales. These were organized, each card in its own plastic sleeve, sorted into rows. The flashlight beam caught the glossy surfaces, the bright colors still vivid despite their age. Margaret didn't know much about baseball. She'd never followed sports, but even she recognized some of these names. Mickey Mantle, Willie Mays, Roberto Clemente. Names her grandmother had mentioned sometimes when baseball games played on the television. She checked the second box. More cards. And the third. All carefully preserved, all organized with someone's obvious care and attention. Then she turned to the chest. It wasn't locked, just latched. Inside, she found notebooks. Journals, actually, with dates written on the covers in her grandmother's handwriting. The earliest was from 1965. The most recent was from just 2 years ago. Beneath the journals lay a white envelope, yellowed with age. Across the front, written in English in her grandmother's careful script, "To whoever finds this." Margaret sat down right there on the basement floor, her back against the cold wall. She opened the envelope with trembling fingers and unfolded the letter inside. The paper was thick, good quality. The handwriting was shaky but readable. "If you are reading this," it began, "then I am gone, and someone has finally found what I have hidden for so long." Margaret's eyes filled with tears, but she kept reading. The letter told a story she'd never heard before. Her grandmother had worked as a housekeeper. Margaret knew that much, but she didn't know about the family Lynn had worked for in the 1960s, a wealthy family in Pacific Heights with a big house and a teenage son named Timothy. Timothy loved baseball more than anything. He collected cards obsessively, trading with friends, saving allowance money to buy packs at the drugstore, organizing his collection with the dedication of a scientist. His parents thought it was a waste of time. His father wanted him focused on school, on preparing for business college. But Timothy's mother was kinder. She let him keep his collection, let him spend hours sorting and cataloging. Then, in 1968, Timothy's parents died in a car accident. He was 19 years old. Margaret read faster now, drawn into the story. The extended family descended like vultures, according to her grandmother's account. Aunts and uncles and cousins who'd barely spoken to Timothy's parents suddenly showed up, claiming ownership of everything. They fought over jewelry, furniture, bank accounts. They hired lawyers. They said horrible things to each other. Timothy was devastated. Not just by losing his parents, but by watching his family tear itself apart over possessions, over money, over things that suddenly seemed so meaningless. One evening, he came to the kitchen where Lynn was cleaning up after another awful family meeting. He was holding 2 large boxes. His card collection. "Mrs. Chen," he said, using the formal name even though she'd told him to call her Lynn. "I need your help." He explained that he was leaving. He'd enlisted in the army and would be shipping out to Vietnam in 3 weeks. He couldn't take his cards with him, and he didn't trust any of his relatives not to sell them or throw them away. They'd already said his collection was childish, worthless, but it wasn't worthless to him. Those cards represented every happy afternoon of his childhood, every summer day trading with friends, every moment of peace when the world felt too big and complicated. "Will you keep them safe?" he asked. "Just until I come back?" Lynn said yes. Of course she said yes. This boy had always been kind to her, had learned to say hello in Cantonese, had asked about her family, had treated her like a person, not just hired help. He gave her the collection that night. He also gave her a list of every card, meticulously handwritten, and he made her promise not to tell his relatives. They wouldn't understand. They'd try to take the cards and sell them. This was his one treasure, the one thing he wanted protected from their greed. 3 months later, Timothy shipped out to Vietnam. 6 months after that, Lynn learned he'd been killed in action. She was cleaning the family house when the telegram arrived. The family had already divided up the estate and sold the house by then. Lynn had found another job, but she still had Timothy's boxes hidden in her own basement. Margaret set the letter down and pressed her hands to her face. Her grandmother had carried the secret for over 50 years, longer than Margaret had been alive. She picked up one of the journals and opened it to a random page. It was dated 1973. "Today I thought about selling the cards," her grandmother had written. "I looked up their value. Even now they are worth thousands of dollars. Thousands. I could buy a new car. I could visit my sister in Hong Kong. But every time I think about selling them, I see Timothy's face. That boy trusted me. He died believing his collection was safe. How can I betray that trust even if he's gone? Even if no one would ever know?" Margaret flipped through more pages. Different years, same struggle. Again and again, her grandmother had wrestled with what to do. The cards increased in value. Her own financial struggles came and went. But she never sold them. Never told anyone. She'd even tried to find Timothy's relatives, the letter explained. but the only ones she could locate were the same people he'd wanted to keep the cards away from. So she kept the secret. Year after year, decade after decade, waiting for some answer that never came. Margaret sat in that hidden room for a long time, surrounded by baseball cards and her grandmother's words. Outside, San Francisco went about its business. Cars drove past. Fog rolled in from the ocean. Life continued like normal, but nothing felt normal anymore. Margaret had come here to empty a house and solve a problem. Instead, she'd found a treasure that wasn't hers. A trust that had been kept for 50 years. And a decision she had no idea how to make. She gathered everything carefully. The boxes of cards. The journals. The letter. She carried them upstairs into the light and spread them across the dining room table. Then she did what people do when their world suddenly shifts. She made a cup of tea, sat down, and tried to figure out what the hell she was supposed to do next. Margaret didn't sleep that night. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, her mind spinning with questions. What were the cards actually worth now? Should she tell someone? Who would even believe this story? By morning, she'd made one decision. She needed to know what she was dealing with. Real information, not guesses. She called in sick to both her jobs, something she almost never did, and spent the morning on her laptop researching vintage baseball cards. What she found made her dizzy. A 1952 Mickey Mantle card had sold for over $1 million. A Honus Wagner card went for even more. The websites she visited were full of collectors discussing cards like they were stocks or real estate investments. People tracked condition ratings, authentication marks, auction results. It was an entire world she'd never known existed. She looked at the boxes sitting on her dining table. How many cards were in there? Hundreds, maybe thousands? And if even a few of them were valuable, then what her grandmother had been hiding wasn't just a collection, it was a fortune. Margaret's hands shook as she closed her laptop. This was too big, too complicated. She needed help from someone who actually knew about these things. She found a sports memorabilia shop in the city, a place with good reviews and an owner who'd been in business for 30 years. She called and explained vaguely that she had inherited some old baseball cards and wanted them evaluated. The man on the phone, Robert, sounded friendly but not particularly excited. He probably got calls like this all the time from people who thought their childhood collections were worth millions. "Sure, bring them by," he said. "I can take a look. Fair warning, though. Most cards from the 70s and 80s aren't worth much. The market was oversaturated." "These are from the 50s and 60s, Margaret said. There was a pause. "All of them?" "I think so." "And what condition are they in?" Margaret looked at the neat rows of plastic-sleeved cards. "Good. They've been kept in a basement, but they're protected." "In sleeves." Another pause, longer this time. "Bring them in today if you can. I'll clear my afternoon." Margaret loaded 3 of the smaller boxes into her car. She didn't want to bring everything at once. Part of her still worried this might be some kind of scam, though she wasn't sure what kind. She drove across the city to a small shop wedged between a dry cleaner and a Po restaurant. Robert turned out to be a balding man in his 60s with reading glasses hanging around his neck. His shop was cramped, every surface covered with framed jerseys, signed baseballs, and display cases full of cards. It smelled like old paper and plastic. He gestured for her to set the boxes on his counter and immediately opened the first one. Margaret watched his face change as he started going through the cards. His casual expression shifted to focus, then to surprise, then to something like shock. "Where did you get these?" he asked, not looking up. "My grandmother. She kept them for someone." He pulled out a card carefully, holding it by the edges. A Mickey Mantle rookie card. The colors still bright, the corners still sharp. He examined it under a special light with a magnifying glass. "Do you know what you have here?" His voice was quiet, almost reverent. "Valuable cards?" He looked at her like she'd just said the ocean was damp. "This single card, if it's authentic and the condition grades as high as I think it will, is worth somewhere between $100,000 and $200,000. "Just this one card." Margaret grabbed the counter to steady herself. "That can't be right. I need to be careful here." Robert set the card down gently. "I need to examine everything properly. Some of these will need professional authentication, which costs money but is absolutely necessary. And I'm only looking at one box. You said you have more?" "2 more in the car. And more at home." Robert removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. "I've been doing this for 35 years. I've seen maybe 3 collections like this walk through my door. Most people's grandparents' baseball cards are commons from the junk wax era. But this? He gestured at the boxes. This is museum quality. This is someone who knew exactly what they were doing. They spent the next 3 hours going through the cards. Robert made notes, took photos, handled each card like it might dissolve under his fingers. He kept muttering to himself. Unbelievable. Look at that centering. No creases. How is this possible? Finally, he sat back and looked at Margaret seriously. I can't give you an exact number without proper grading. But based on what I'm seeing, and this is conservative, you're looking at somewhere between $3 and $5 million, maybe more at the right auction. The shop tilted. Margaret actually felt the world tilt sideways. She sat down hard on a stool Robert kept behind the counter. Million? She could barely get the word out. Million. He nodded. And that's being careful. If some of these grade higher than I expect, or if there's a bidding war at auction, it could go even higher. This is a life-changing collection. Margaret thought about her rent increase. $400 that had felt like the end of the world 2 weeks ago. She thought about her 2 jobs, her tired feet, her daughter's school supplies she'd put on a credit card. She thought about her grandmother scrubbing other people's toilets, keeping this secret, struggling while sitting on a fortune. Why? The question came out as a whisper. Why didn't she sell them? Robert glanced at the grandmother's letter Margaret had brought, sitting on the counter beside the boxes. Sounds like she made a promise. Some people take promises seriously. He explained what would happen next if she wanted to sell. Authentication services, grading companies, auction houses that specialized in sports memorabilia. It would take months. There would be fees, commissions, taxes. But even after all that, she'd walk away with enough money to change her entire life. Think about it, Robert said. Don't rush. And please, store these properly. Climate-controlled if possible. They've survived this long, but they're fragile. Margaret drove home in a daze. She called her daughter's school and arranged to pick her up early. Something she never did. Amy climbed into the car looking worried. Are you okay, Mom? Are you sick? No, baby. I'm okay. I just needed to see you. They went to Amy's favorite taco place, a tiny spot they could barely afford but saved for special occasions. Amy chattered about her day, a test she'd aced, drama with her friends. Normal 12-year-old things. Margaret watched her daughter's animated face and felt the weight of the decision pressing down on her chest. That night, after Amy went to bed, Margaret sat with her grandmother's journals. She read entry after entry, year after year of the same struggle, the same question her grandmother had asked herself over and over. In a journal from 1989, Lynn had written something that made Margaret stop cold. Today I saw a man on the street, and for a moment I thought it was Timothy. Of course it wasn't. Timothy has been dead for 20 years, but my heart jumped anyway. I realized I've been waiting all this time, waiting for him to come back and prove I did the right thing, waiting for someone to tell me what to do with this burden he left me. But no one is coming. No one can tell me the answer. I must carry this weight until I die, and then it will be someone else's weight to carry. Margaret closed the journal. Her grandmother had carried the weight. Now it was her turn. The cards were legally hers. She'd inherited the house and everything in it. No one else knew they existed. She could sell them, pay off every debt, give Amy the life she deserved. She could quit her jobs, rest, breathe. But there was someone else in this story. Timothy had a family. Somewhere out there he might have children, grandchildren, people who'd never known about his collection. People who had no idea their father or grandfather had trusted a housekeeper with his most prized possession. Margaret opened her laptop again. This time she wasn't searching for card values. She was searching for something much harder to find. She typed in Timothy's full name, the one from her grandmother's letter. She added Vietnam veteran in 1968. The search began, and Margaret knew that whatever she found, whatever she decided, there would be no going back from this moment. The secret was out. The weight was hers now. And unlike her grandmother, she couldn't just hide it away and hope for an answer that never came. She had to choose. Finding someone who died 50 years ago turned out to be harder than Margaret expected. Timothy's full name was common enough that hundreds of results came up. She spent hours sorting through obituaries, military records, genealogy websites. Most led nowhere. Wrong person, wrong dates, dead ends. After a week of searching on her own, Margaret admitted she needed professional help. She found a private investigator through a legal referral service, a woman named Patricia, who specialized in finding heirs and lost family members. They met at a coffee shop downtown. Patricia listened to the whole story without interrupting. When Margaret finished, the investigator sat back and stirred her coffee slowly. "This is going to cost you," Patricia said. "Not just money, though. Yes, there'll be fees. I mean emotionally. Are you sure you want to do this? Because legally, those cards are yours. Your grandmother left them to you. You could sell them tomorrow and no one could say anything." "I know." Margaret had thought about nothing else for days, but it doesn't feel right. He trusted my grandmother. She kept that trust her whole life. If I just take the money and walk away, what does that say about me? Patricia nodded slowly. "Okay, but understand something. If we find Timothy's family, they might not be grateful. They might be angry your grandmother never told them. They might lawyer up and try to claim everything. They might make your life very difficult. I understand. And they might not want anything to do with it. Or with you. People are complicated. Grief is complicated. You might open a door you can't close." Margaret thought about her grandmother's journals, all those years of wrestling with the same questions. "The door's already open. I just need to know who should walk through it." Patricia charged $2,000 up front, with more due if the search took longer than expected. It was money Margaret didn't have. So she took out a small loan against the house. Another debt added to her pile. But somehow it felt necessary, like she couldn't move forward without doing this one thing right. 2 weeks passed. Patricia called with updates every few days. She'd found Timothy's military records, his parents' death certificates, property records from the old house in Pacific Heights. Each piece of information was another thread in a story that had started before Margaret was born. Then, on a Tuesday afternoon while Margaret was restocking soup cans at work, her phone rang. "I found her," Patricia said without preamble. "Timothy's daughter. She lives in Oregon." Margaret's hand froze on a can of tomato soup. He had a daughter? Born in 1969, 7 months after he died. His girlfriend was pregnant when he shipped out. They were planning to get married when he came home. She gave the baby his last name, raised her as a single mother. The can slipped from Margaret's fingers and hit the floor with a metallic bang. Her supervisor glared from across the aisle. Margaret picked it up with shaking hands. "Does she know about the cards?" "She doesn't know about anything. According to what I found, she never met her father. He died before she was born. Her mother passed away a few years ago. She's in her 50s now, works as a nurse, has 2 grown kids of her own." Margaret leaned against the shelf. "A daughter. Timothy had a daughter who grew up without him, who never knew him, who had no idea her father had once been a boy who loved baseball cards more than anything. What's her name?" "Jennifer. Jennifer Morrison. Want me to make contact?" Margaret's first instinct was to say yes. Let the professional handle it. But then she thought about how she'd feel if a stranger called with news like this, how she'd want to hear it from someone who understood the weight of it. "No," she said. "Give me her number. I'll call her myself." That evening, Margaret sat at her kitchen table with Jennifer's phone number written on a piece of paper in front of her. She must have picked up her phone 20 times. Each time, she put it back down. What do you even say? How do you start a conversation like this? Finally, at almost 9 o'clock, she dialed before she could change her mind again. The phone rang 3 times. A woman answered, her voice cautious the way people sound when they don't recognize the number. "Hello? Hi, is this Jennifer Morrison?" "Yes, who's this?" Margaret took a deep breath. "My name is Margaret Chen. You don't know me, but I need to talk to you about your father." "About Timothy." Silence on the other end. Long enough that Margaret thought the call had dropped. "My father?" Jennifer's voice came back different, smaller. "How do you know about my father?" "It's a long story. Is this a good time?" "I promise I'm not selling anything. I'm not trying to scam you. I just have something that belonged to him. Something important." Another pause. "What kind of something? Can we maybe talk on video? It would be easier to show you." They switched to a video call. Jennifer's face appeared on screen, a woman with graying hair and her father's eyes, though Margaret only knew that from the one photo she'd found online. Jennifer looked skeptical and a little scared. Margaret showed her the letter first, held it up to the camera and let Jennifer read her grandmother's words. She watched Jennifer's expression change from suspicion to confusion to something that looked like pain. "Your grandmother knew my father. She worked for his family. He trusted her with something before he went to Vietnam." Margaret moved the camera to show the boxes of cards on her table. He gave her his baseball card collection. Asked her to keep it safe until he came home. Jennifer's hand went to her mouth. He collected cards? I didn't know that. I don't know anything about him. My mom never talked much about him. It hurt too much. There's more. Margaret pulled out one of the cards carefully. These cards are valuable. Really valuable. I had them appraised. The whole collection is worth millions of dollars, Jennifer laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. It was the laugh of someone who's just been told something impossible. That's not real. That can't be real. It is. I can send you the appraisal documents. I can give you the name of the expert who looked at them. Jennifer, your father left behind something incredible. Tears were running down Jennifer's face now. I never had anything of his, nothing. My mom kept one photo. That's it. And now you're telling me he had this whole collection, this whole part of his life, and I never knew. They talked for 2 hours. Margaret told her everything. Read passages from Lynn's journals. Explained how her grandmother had kept the secret for so long. Showed her more cards. Described Robert's reaction, walked her through the timeline of it all. Jennifer told her side too. Growing up without a father. The questions that never got answered. The empty space in her life shaped like a man she'd never known. Her own kids asking about their grandfather and having nothing to tell them. Why didn't your grandmother reach out? Jennifer asked. Not angry, just genuinely confused. Why keep it hidden? She tried, but the only family members she could find were the ones your father didn't trust. The ones fighting over his parents' estate. And then years passed and it got harder. I think she didn't know how to explain keeping it secret for so long. Jennifer nodded slowly, wiping her eyes. What happens now? That was the question, wasn't it? Margaret had found her. Made contact. Told the truth. But now came the hard part. The part her grandmother never had to face. The cards are legally mine, Margaret said carefully. I inherited them with the house. But morally, they were your father's. He trusted my grandmother with them. And now I'm asking you what you think we should do. What do you think we should do? Margaret had been asking herself that same question for weeks. She thought about her rent increase, her 2 jobs, her daughter's future. She thought about her grandmother scrubbing floors and keeping promises. She thought about Timothy, 19 years old and heading to war, trusting a housekeeper because his own family had failed him. I think, Margaret said slowly, we should figure this out together. This isn't just my decision to make anymore. Jennifer was quiet for a moment. Then she said, can I come see them? The cards, I mean, and your grandmother's house. I want to see where he gave them to her. Where this all started. Of course. When? This weekend? I can drive down Saturday morning. After they hung up, Margaret sat in the dark for a long time. She'd done it. Found Timothy's daughter. Told her the truth. Opened that door Patricia had warned her about. There was no going back now. Whatever happened next, whatever they decided, at least she'd done the right thing. At least she'd honored her grandmother's trust, even if Lynn herself had never quite managed to do it. The cards sat in their boxes, waiting. They'd waited 50 years already. They could wait a little longer. Saturday morning arrived gray and misty, typical San Francisco weather. Margaret cleaned her apartment twice, rearranged the card boxes on her dining table 3 times, and checked her phone every 5 minutes. Amy watched her from the couch with the knowing look that 12-year-olds give their parents when they're being weird. Mom, you're making me nervous and this isn't even my thing. Sorry, baby. I just want everything to be right. It's baseball cards and a stranger coming over. How right does it need to be? Margaret almost laughed. If only it were that simple. But she didn't know how to explain to her daughter what this moment meant. 2 families connected by an old promise finally meeting. A secret kept for 5 decades finally revealed. Everything was about to change one way or another. Jennifer arrived at 10. Margaret watched from the window as a silver sedan pulled up and a woman stepped out, looking up at the apartment building like she was gathering courage. Margaret went downstairs to meet her. They stood facing each other on the sidewalk. 2 strangers bound together by history neither of them had created. Jennifer was tall, thin, with worry lines around her eyes that made her look older than her age. She held a folder against her chest like a shield. Thank you for coming, Margaret said. Thank you for calling. Jennifer's voice shook slightly. I almost didn't believe this was real. They went upstairs. Amy had made herself scarce, hiding in her room with headphones on. The card boxes waited on the table like they'd been waiting for this moment all along. Jennifer sat down slowly and just stared at them for a long moment. Then she reached out and touched the nearest box with her fingertips like it might disappear if she pressed too hard. These belong to my father. They did. Can I look through them? Of course. They're as much yours as mine. Maybe more. Jennifer opened the first box carefully. Her hands trembled as she pulled out the first card. A Mickey mantle, bright and perfect in its protective sleeve. She held it up to the light from the window. He touched this, she whispered. My father held this card. He looked at it, cared about it, thought it was important enough to save. Margaret felt her throat tighten. She'd been so focused on the value, on the money, on the practical questions. But for Jennifer, these weren't investments. They were pieces of a father she'd never known. Evidence that he'd existed, that he'd had interests and passions and dreams. They spent an hour going through the cards together. Margaret told her what Robert had said about the collection's value, showed her the appraisal documents. Jennifer listened, but Margaret could tell the money wasn't what mattered to her right now. She was somewhere else, imagining a 19-year-old boy organizing these cards, caring for them, trusting a housekeeper to keep them safe. I brought something, Jennifer said finally. She opened the folder she'd been carrying. Inside was a single photograph, faded and creased from years of handling. A young man in his army uniform, barely more than a boy, smiling at the camera with his whole future ahead of him. This is the only picture I have of him. My mom kept it on her dresser until she died. That's all I knew of him. One picture and some stories she could barely get through without crying. Margaret looked at Timothy's face. He looked kind, hopeful, nothing like the greedy relatives her grandmother had described. She pulled out her phone and showed Jennifer a picture she'd found in her grandmother's belongings. Lynn and Timothy standing in front of the Victorian house, both smiling. It must have been taken just before he left. Jennifer started crying. Not sad crying exactly, something more complicated. Relief maybe, or grief for something lost before she was born. He looks happy there. With your grandmother, I think they were friends. Real friends, not just employer and housekeeper. I think that's why he trusted her. They sat quietly for a while. Then Jennifer asked the question Margaret had been dreading. What do we do with all this? The cards, I mean. Margaret had practiced this conversation in her head 100 times. She'd planned different speeches depending on how things went. But now, sitting here with Jennifer, all those practiced words felt wrong. I've been thinking about that, Margaret said. These cards are worth millions. Life-changing money for both of us. But here's what I keep coming back to. Your father gave them to my grandmother because his family was fighting over money. Over possessions. He hated what money did to them. So what would he want us to do? Jennifer wiped her eyes. I don't know. I never knew him. But you know what kind of person you are. And I know what kind of person my grandmother was. Maybe that tells us something. They talked for hours. About values and promises and what matters more than money. About families and legacies and doing right by people who can't speak for themselves anymore. Margaret told her about the rent increase that had started all this. About her 2 jobs and her constant struggle to keep her head above water. Jennifer shared her own story. The years of wondering about her father. Raising her kids with questions she couldn't answer. Finally, as afternoon faded into evening, they reached a decision. It felt right in a way Margaret couldn't quite explain. Not logical exactly. Not financially smart, but right in the way her grandmother's choice had been right. Even if it cost her, they would sell the collection, but not keep everything for themselves. Half would go to Jennifer and her family. That part was simple. The other half would be split. Some would help Margaret and Amy, finally give them breathing room and security. The rest would create a scholarship fund in Lynn's name. For immigrant families, Jennifer suggested. Kids whose parents work the jobs nobody sees. The housekeepers and janitors and cafeteria workers. The people like your grandmother who keep promises even when it costs them. Margaret felt something loosen in her chest. Yes, exactly that. They hired Robert to handle the auction. It took 3 months to authenticate and grade all the cards, to set up the sale, to prepare everything properly. The auction itself was held online, with collectors from around the world bidding. Margaret and Jennifer watched together on video call as the numbers climbed higher and higher. The final total was $4.3 million. Even after fees and taxes, it was more money than Margaret had ever imagined having. More than she'd dreamed of during those long shifts at the hospital cafeteria. those late nights cleaning offices. But the money wasn't the part that stuck with her. It was the moment after the auction ended when Jennifer said, "Your grandmother would be proud. She kept faith with my father all those years, and you kept faith with both of them." Margaret used her share to pay off every debt. She quit one of her jobs. Then a few months later, the second one too. She enrolled in nursing school, something she'd wanted to do since she was Amy's age but never thought possible. The Victorian house she renovated properly and sold, using some of the money to move into a small house with a backyard where Amy could have a dog. Jennifer used her share to pay for her kids' student loans and set aside money for her grandchildren's education. But what she treasured most, she told Margaret, was the box of cards she kept. Not the valuable ones, those had been sold. Just regular cards from her father's collection. Commons, Robert had called them. Worth almost nothing to collectors, but to Jennifer they were priceless. Pieces of a father she'd never met. Proof that he'd existed, that he'd cared about things, that he'd been real. The scholarship fund started small but grew. Lynchen Memorial Scholarship. Every year, it helped 10 students from working-class immigrant families pay for college. Kids whose parents cleaned houses or washed dishes or worked night shifts. Kids who might have been Margaret or Amy or Lynn herself, given different circumstances. Margaret kept one thing from the collection. Not a card. The photograph of Lynn and Timothy, young and smiling in front of the Victorian house. She had it framed and hung it in her living room. Sometimes Amy would ask about it, and Margaret would tell her the story. About promises kept and choices made. About doing the right thing even when it's hard. About how sometimes the most valuable things can't be measured in money. Jennifer visited once a year, usually in the summer. They'd have lunch, talk about their families, remember the grandmother and father who'd brought them together. They'd become friends, bound by more than just shared inheritance. Bound by a choice they'd made together to honor something bigger than themselves. Late at night sometimes, when the house was quiet and Amy was asleep, Margaret would look at that photograph and think about her grandmother, all those years of keeping a secret, wrestling with questions that had no easy answers. Lynn had never found the solution she was looking for. But maybe that was okay. Maybe she'd done exactly what she needed to do, kept the cards safe until someone else could make the choice she couldn't. "Thank you, Grandma," Margaret would whisper to the photograph. "You taught me what matters. Not the money. The promise. The trust. The honor in doing right by people, even strangers, even when no one would ever know. And somewhere in whatever place people go after they die, Margaret liked to think her grandmother and Timothy were smiling. Their trust hadn't been misplaced. Their faith in human goodness had been rewarded. Not with money, though that came too, but with something more valuable. With proof that some promises are worth keeping, that some choices matter more than easy answers, and that sometimes, hidden beneath our homes and in our hearts, we all carry secrets worth more than millions.